Hello and welcome to this week's Lunch and Learn. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. Today, we are going to be talking about uh, this phrase that is very key to the scheduling of cannabis, which is the topic of various debates, which is, is cannabis's accepted medical use a political statement or a fact? And we'll also talk about why it matters. So if you hear this phrase, which is also either accepted medical use or currently accepted medical use for treatment in the United States, that phrase is actually directly from the Controlled Substance Act. And that phrase determines whether a substance is Schedule 1 or another schedule. And so before a substance or a drug can move out of Schedule 1, you have to prove that it has accepted medical use. And so again, we are Americans for Safe Access. We are a coalition of patients, medical professionals, uh, medical cannabis stakeholders, wellness and healthcare stakeholders that have come together to put patients at the forefront of advocacy to create safe access to medical cannabis. And we want to see cannabis uh, integrated into our healthcare system in a way that it can be covered by insurance, that medical professionals are using it as a frontline treatment, and that we're living in a world where we won't see discrimination in employment, housing, parental or healthcare rights. So, as you could probably imagine, we do not think that this statement is political. And what is spurring this specific topic is some activity in Congress and in the media that we'll get into. So today, 2/3 of clinicians um, believe that cannabis has medicinal value, but only a quarter of them are actually recommending. Uh, and we live in a world where every state, except for Idaho, has some type of medical cannabis law. And in the past rescheduling petitions, both HHS and Department of Justice basically said that our state programs, they're a political act, and that even though all of these states have passed medical cannabis laws, that it's not enough to show any type of consensus that there's currently accepted medical use for treatment in the United States. So what's at the core of this is last year, the Department of Justice uh, issued a notice of rulemaking, which means, before they could change the schedule of cannabis, they had, HHS did a review and then handed that over to the Department of Justice, where the DEA and the Department of Justice went through it, and then they proposed the change of schedule, which HHS had suggested that it become a Schedule 3. And, in the Department of Justice's press release, they specifically said that they were proposing this rule to move cannabis from 1 to 3 because of its currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States. So following this proposal, we saw a group of Republicans actually send a letter to the Attorney General, Attorney General Garland, protesting this proposed rule. And, their point of view, and, also you'll see that, DEA kind of felt like this as well. But, they basically said that the Department of Justice is just, responding to popularity of marijuana and not actual science. And so if you read the 90-page proposal to change cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, you'll see throughout the document, DEA, um, as they're going through the 8-factor analysis, which is all of the steps they have to look at in determining the schedule of a substance, the DEA keeps referring back to the last rescheduling petition, which of course ended in a denial of rescheduling. That started with HHS issuing their findings in 2015, and then DEA denying the starting a rescheduling process based on those findings. And so throughout this proposed rule, when as DOJ is going through each of the 8-factor analysis and going through the rationale for finding its currently accepted medical use, they keep referring back, saying, we like what HHS said in 2015. And, again, I think there's something, like 12 different references where DEA is looking back and referring back to these documents and not really listening to HHS's findings in the interim. And so, when the Department of Justice, issued this press release, most of the news coverage was really focused on whether or not this was some sort of political move from President Biden for his reelection campaign, which, a lot of, that perspective, as well as the perspective that this was going to, result in cannabis businesses being able to deduct business expenses. This really came from sort of press releases that came from cannabis businesses, especially publicly traded cannabis businesses. And so instead of talking about what this meant for patients, really diving into the fact that the only reason we're having this conversation about changing the schedules is because of its accepted medical use, really the only thing that was debated was this idea of big marijuana. And so we saw a lot of uh, op-eds with this framework, right? That cannabis rescheduling is only going to help out big marijuana, and that's sort of what led to the letter that I mentioned that we're going to talk about in more detail in a minute. But what's kind of crazy is that also in the proposed rule, the Department of Justice makes it very clear that if cannabis was moved to Schedule 3, the manufacturing, the distribution, the dispensing, possession, it would all still remain subject to the applicable criminal prohibition of Schedule 3 substances. So what that means is that the only legal cannabis would be cannabis that had gone through an FDA approval process, and that just doesn't exist. So all of the state programs that exist today, the adult use and the medical, those are all happening outside of the Controlled Substance Act. And so whether this was Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, without being registered through the FDA, all of those businesses are still illegal. There would have to be an act of Congress to move the cannabis businesses we see today into that infrastructure. And so, this idea that, all of this, these businesses would be legal was really not true. And again, the Department of Justice made that very clear. And so an example is, think about other Schedule 3 substances that are used outside of their proper prescription, right? So like purple dink, codeine, cough syrup, you know, people who are selling those products are not able to deduct their business expenses from their taxes. And, again, I think a part of this conversation was really meant to drive stock prices up for publicly traded companies and there wasn't really a lot of critical thinking here. So in the United States, you have to pay taxes for any income, however it is earned. And uh, the statute is very clear, and there's also a lot of case law. And you may remember Al Capone. Even though he obviously committed other crimes, what ended up putting him in prison was taxes, that he hadn't paid his taxes on his income. And so 280E, which is the tax code that prohibits deducting business expenses for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances, while it is true that if cannabis was Schedule 3, that 280E would no longer apply to businesses, there's other tax law that makes it very clear that uh, businesses or any income made from an illicit activity, you can't deduct business expenses. So there would still need to be an act of Congress if cannabis was moved to Schedule 3. And so again, this sort of domination, in the media of the impact on businesses and the sort of political nature that, this was a ploy by Biden to get reelected, which, by the way, there was just no way that this rescheduling process was going to be finished before the election. It led to, really a resurgence of the anti-cannabis lobby in DC. And so not only do we see the letter from the Republicans to the Attorney General, we also saw Republicans in the CJS committee, Appropriations Committee, which is the subcommittee of appropriations. So the people that look at the budgets and decide budgets. And CJS is they're the subcommittee that look over the Department of Justice's budget. So they actually passed an amendment to that, to the budget that said that the Department of Justice could not spend any of its funds continuing on with the rescheduling process. And then they also modified a medical cannabis amendment that we passed in 2014 that we've been able to include in every appropriations bill since, that actually opened the door for federal interference in states with medical cannabis laws. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So I just want to take some time and really focus on, really what's happened between these two findings from HHS. So in May 2015, when they were looking at rescheduling cannabis, they came back with the recommendation that cannabis stay Schedule 1. And in 2023, they came back and said that, that their recommendation was that it was placed in Schedule 3. And I think, really, taking time to understand the difference between, the sort of landscape is important for several reasons. And one is that, I think there's a lot more people paying attention to cannabis right now. And, now that we do have the top health agencies agreeing with us that cannabis has accepted medical use, I think it's important for us to really think about, how we're going to ultimately win. And in political theory and political organizing, there's this sort of old rule, which is if your opponent can be right, then it's going to be easier for you to win, right? And so a question I've been sort of posing to our opposition is, could you agree with HHS in 2015 and then also agree with them in 2023? And so, again, looking at uh, these sort of timeline, you have to also remember that the 2015 rescheduling petition was actually based on a petition that was filed by the governor of Rhode Island and the governor of Washington in 2011, right? So we're really talking about a framework of 2011 and 2023. And a lot has happened. And in fact, the comments that I submitted on behalf of ASA to the rescheduling process actually was covering, some of this finding, because it was clear in the proposed rule that the DEA hadn't really made up its mind if it agreed with HHS. And, as I was reading other comments, I realized nobody was really looking at, okay, what has happened? And it seemed pretty important to the DEA. So I think it's pretty significant. And even, the Department of Justice recognized that, HHS in this, their latest findings, they were basically evaluating things that had happened, maybe after they put out that their findings in 2015. But really, if you have read through their findings as much as I have, you'll see that really they were just sort of responding to the petition that was filed in 2011. Okay, so this is what medical cannabis looked like in 2011 when the governors filed the petition for rescheduling. So there were 16 states that have medical cannabis laws. 13 of them were operating, but only 5 had distribution programs. There were only 286,000 registered patients. And part of that number is because Washington, California, Hawaii, that they didn't have ID cards yet. So there were a lot of, participating patients that were just hard to count with data from the state. And then, DC, Delaware, New Jersey, they hadn't even started their programs yet. And so we had actually estimated that there was probably about 600,000 patients that were participating in these programs in Washington, California, Hawaii, but they just didn't have ID cards. So, again, move ahead to HHS's findings, and, the Department of Justice, something that they had in the proposed rule was actually, the information that HHS had put in their findings, which is at, this time, there's over 30,000 healthcare providers that they found that were actually recommending cannabis. And there's over 6 million registered cannabis patients. So pretty significant. And there are also, as we know, lots of medical cannabis patients that are not registered in these programs. So I guess is that, it's at least 6 million, if not double that, when we see, especially with patients who are not enrolling in programs, especially if there's adult use also in the state. But they also recognize that that there's actually clinical experience with a lot of these conditions, and that, we're now talking about a substantial number of jurisdictions. So substantial, we're talking about all but Idaho. I guess when they wrote this, Idaho and Nebraska. And, that they also recognize that, these programs include some of the monitoring of these conditions. So also when the governors filed their rescheduling petition, we hadn't yet received the product safety protocols from the American Herbal Products Association, which worked with ASA to actually create the supply chain wide product safety protocols for cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and laboratories, which is actually one of the considerations that HHS and DEA had continuously mentioned. And we they didn't have the monograph that came out from the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia that really not only helped with defining some of these standards, but also helped with creating methods for laboratories. And in case you hadn't heard, Michael McGuffin, who was the president of the American Herbal Products Association, just recently passed away. And I put this in here because he was a very humble man, but Michael was at the helm of APA when Americans for Safe Access, when we reached out for help to create product safety protocols for cannabis. And without the leadership and support and mentorship of Michael, it's unclear, how far we would be as far as the distribution programs at the state level. So also in 2015, sorry, I have to move on or I'll get a little choked up. In 2015, we saw the first qualifying condition added to a state law after going through a formal review process. And so, there's actually 21 of the medical cannabis programs. They include a process to add qualifying conditions that is actually, requires going through an expert committee. And the reason this is significant is that, part of HHS's, establishing that there is accepted medical use. Like one of the things that they really, felt like was a strong indicator was actually this process, right? That they were actually going through the process of, with experts looking at this. And the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel agreed. So again, DEA has been sort of resistance to this. So one of the questions they asked the Office of Legal Counsel was, looking at how HHS had approached defining currently accepted medical use. And, they felt that because of this process and that 17 jurisdictions had actually added conditions going through this process, that it's simply not the case that state practice concerning medical marijuana is completely divorced of scientific and medical assessment. And, going back again to HHS's findings in 2015, they indicated that, just the fact that medical practitioners were writing recommendations, which is, one of the arguments that the governors made, is that, the fact that there's, 280 thousand patients that, that have a recommendation from their doctor, that should be proof that there is currently accepted medical use. And HHS said, no, those people writing those recommendations, they're not experts in evaluating drugs. And so they can't be considered qualifying experts. And, they also said that medical cannabis laws, that they're not providing evidence for the consensus among qualified experts. And so, the fact that, there have been 65 qualifying conditions added to medical cannabis programs through an expert review. And, these expert reviews were created by departments of health is very significant in the process. And, it makes sense, right? currently accepted medical use for treatment in the United States. Uh, it's pretty much wrapped up in a bow right there. Also in 2016, we saw medical boards actually started providing medical professionals with, not just a breakdown of what was legal and their review of that, but actually, how to determine if you should recommend cannabis. And I think this is definitely significant because in every state where we've passed a medical cannabis law, the medical association of that state has always come out against the medical cannabis law. And, it's always frustrating when that would happen. But if you actually, sort of read their opposition, they were all calling for more research. And what they were saying is that cannabis is not a medicine as they know a medicine, right? Which means for in the United States, that means an FDA approved drug, which they're correct. Cannabis is not an FDA approved drug, um, uh, which is why we saw that opposition. But again, this was why it was so significant to start seeing medical boards actually, going beyond just the legal arguments and sort of the semantics of FDA approval and really looking at the merits of, how to integrate cannabis into their patients' care. 2016, the CDC actually put out a notice when they were talking about ways to deal with the opioid epidemic. One was for pain clinics and for clinicians to actually stop testing for cannabis as a reason to stop caring for patients. And so basically there, a lot of these pain clinics would actually make patients sign, and these still exist in many states. They have to sign contracts saying that they won't use any illicit drugs. And of course, cannabis is, because it stays in your system so long as is what they usually find in people's system. And so they were kicking them out of the pain clinics, which meant they were, having to find treatment beyond cannabis, from the illicit market. In 2017, the National Academies of Science put out this very significant report that found that there is conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective in the treatment of chronic pain in adults as an anti-emetics in the treatment of chemotherapy, induced nausea and vomiting, and for improving patient-reported MS spasticity symptoms. So this is huge, right? This is a pretty significant finding that it's happened since the last determination. We also saw, beyond sort of the CDC's suggestions, we actually saw states starting to adopt, pain as a qualifying condition. And for many people who maybe have just sort of come into the medical cannabis space, you may not know that most of the states, when they were first passed, did not include pain, right? Because most of the state laws were created with sort of the mind frame to only allow as few people as possible into them. And, as we started seeing, just 91 deaths a day at the height of the uh, opioid epidemic, states were looking for ways to deal with this. And we were, successful in getting Connecticut, DC, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York to add pain as a qualifying condition. As one of the tools that they could use to deal with this crisis. We also have seen this sort of phenomenon of universities and colleges offering cannabis specialty degrees. So, this isn't just a class here or there. It's not just a political studies class about the prohibition of cannabis. These are are real degrees in actually, being a part of the supply chain and research. And so, again, when these governors filed their petition, we didn't see this level of professional development. And these are, they're not cannabis only universities. These are, universities where, we see many of our doctors, University of Maryland School of Pharmacy is very well known in their contribution um, to science and to the field of medicine. Um, and so this is, pretty exciting, pretty big development. On the international front, which may not be as important to people in DC right now, but the World Health Organization, actually, made a recommendation to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs that they should change the schedule of cannabis in the drug treaties. So that was in 2019. And then in December 2020, the UNCND actually made that change. And so if you're not aware of the significance of this, uh, the the whole reason we actually have a Controlled Substance Act was because we signed on to the 1961 UN Single Treaty in 1967. And one of the requirements of being a signator of that treaty was that you had established control over drugs, including cannabis. And that is sort of at the core of our, uh, war on drugs, but specifically the federal government's ability to enforce the war on drugs. And so we would not be able to change the scheduling of cannabis without that change at the international level. We also, started seeing many universities actually create cannabis research centers. CMCR was actually created in California in 2000 through an act of the legislature. But they were mostly dependent on NIDA funding. And in 2018, 2019, we started seeing funds coming from state programs to a lot of these research centers, as well as some other private funding. In 2022, we were able to pass the Research Act, but more significantly, this was actually led by some of the biggest opponents of medical cannabis, actually championed our legislation, sort of a Jedi mind trick, not really, but it's pretty exciting to see, people who had, really been fighting us in DC for allowing cannabis to move forward. So again, proof that there is bipartisan support for cannabis. In 2022, the Department of Health of Minnesota put out this amazing dosing guide to help medical professionals and patients really start looking at cannabinoids and what doses would look like, which is actually something very specific in the rescheduling petition. And in 2023, only 2 countries had medical cannabis laws, and now there's over 60 countries that have federal medical cannabis programs. We are not one of them. Uh, and then in 2023, the International Narcotics Control Board, which sort of oversees the international drugs, both licit and illicit, put out this guidance document that said, in fact, that member states that are signed on to the 61 treaty would not be in violation of that treaty if they, changed the scheduling or if they had a medical cannabis program. And again, this is the citation in the Controlled Substance Act, if you're interested. And in 2023, the American Nurses Association officially recognized cannabis as a specialty for nursing. And that's what led to HHS's finding. So as you can see, there's, quite a bit has happened, and we're just seeing more and more organizations, calling for a change and for access, and at the very least, a recognition of cannabis's accepted medical use. And so the reason that this is important, why this specific term, why it's important for advocates to really understand what's happened in this space is that I mentioned before there's a resurgence of the anti-cannabis lobby. The DEA hearings around the rescheduling have been postponed because of some political actions, I guess, of some attorneys. You can see Ace's blog if you want to do more of a deep dive into that, but it's unclear what's going to happen next. So we're really just at a standstill. And you'll see in a minute, the current, new director of the DEA is not necessarily helpful. But, basically, anything could happen from here. They could actually, go back to the OLC and ask, if they can, examine those rulings that allowed them to move forward with HHS's findings. They could call for a new hearing. They could start the whole process over again with public comments. So we just have to stay tuned to see what happens. And, we're waiting to see right now what's going to happen with the budgets, but most likely we're going to have a continuing resolution that is going to push our budgets back to September 30th, which is where the Farm Bill is as well. But in the last session of Congress is where we saw, attacks to the programs I mentioned. So again, there was this amendment that was passed in appropriations that would stop the rescheduling process that the DOJ is currently going through. And just saying that this would have to go through Congress. And then this amendment to our amendment that says that the Department of Justice can enforce violations of 21 USC 860, which is, you probably know these as like drug-free zones. You've probably seen them outside of schools. Well, drug-free zones, they are, this is how they're defined. It's a pretty big list, and it's much bigger than the sort of special uses that we have at the state level. But what's significant is that actually the fines and the punishment for someone violating the Controlled Substance Act, 1,000 feet from a school, a junior college, 1,000 feet from a playground or housing facility, or an arcade, obviously written in the 80s, is that it's double the punishment, double the fine. And so if you're unaware of what the sentencing is for cannabis, it's pretty significant. And they include mandatory minimums of 10 years, 5 years, and depending on how many other violations you've had, you can get a life sentence. And if somebody is injured, in somewhere along the way, either from harm from the product itself or through some type of violence, then that increases significantly. So there are a few people that are still in prison, but for a lot of people who have come into this space after 2014, I don't know if you know about the hundreds of people that went to jail. And I think people like to tell themselves that, oh, those people were breaking the law. Well, everyone's breaking the law. If you are selling cannabis, if you're using cannabis, you're in violation of federal law. And while we have some protections over medical, this is still illegal. And the people who went to jail, until we passed the CJS amendment, they were not doing anything different than what we see today. And we actually saw, most of those raids actually happened under the Obama administration. So this idea that, oh, this was just something that Bush Jr. did, it's just not true. This is actually without protections. It's not enough just for, the sentiment of the Department of Justice, it's not move forward. So let's get back to that letter. Okay, so the 25 lawmakers signed the letter that I mentioned, um, uh, Republicans. And why this is significant is that all of these people are now in power. So in the Senate leadership, Thune, Capito, and Langford, they're actually setting the agenda for Republicans for what, determine what is going to be on the floor, what policies they're going to take up. So that's a challenge. But also, the signatories of that letter are the chairs of the CJS Appropriations Subcommittee in both the House and Senate, in both the House and Senate for health. And, no matter where you sort of are on the political spectrum, I think one thing is clear that maybe people were arguing before the election, and that is that, President Trump seems to be, whether he's read it or not, is sort of following, the guidance of Project 2025. And if you haven't read it, it's a 900-page document. It's a little crazy, but here is a specific page that you can look at, see that, they believe that, that the federal government should step in and enforce federal laws where states and local governments are failing to do so. And so they're actually talking about specifically about drug activity. They actually mention actually going after possession, which is something the federal government has never done. And, this is definitely a little disturbing when we see, the leadership in Congress, which is the only real protections. And, a lot of people may not be aware of this, but there's actually nothing protecting the adult use market. For medical, we have the CJS amendment, and, we know that that will hold. We saw that, in Trump's first administration when super anti little elf Sessions was the Attorney General. He removed what was called the Cole memo, and was ready to really go after cannabis, and realized that he could not go after medical cannabis because of the CJS amendment. So we know that will hold, but there is literally all of the adult use businesses are just the only reason they're not being rated or shut down is just at the whim of the executive branch. So one of the things that we've been sort of factoring in is looking at one, what is the likelihood that there could be some type of attack on adult use spaces? Because, as medical cannabis advocates, we know that a lot of these states have been collapsing their medical program into their adult use. So if there is some type of enforcement on adult use, that will really impact patients. And, when we look at the 24 states that have adult use programs, only 8 of the 24 have Republican governors. And so, if there is a political statement being made, this is just one sort of way to look at it. And so we're definitely trying to work with state regulators to make sure that there is a plan for medical cannabis patients in the event that this happens. So then we also have the Farm Bill coming up for reauthorization. We saw amendments to the Farm Bill to try to rein in the intoxicating hemp we need to sort of know where the DEA stands. This is a couple of the letters, including THCA, that they feel like it does not fit the definition of hemp. And we saw sort of amendments to to the hemp section of the Farm Bill that follow that. The new head of DEA is pretty anti-cannabis. Luckily, it doesn't look like he has a lot of friends, but unfortunately, he does have a position of power. And again, the leadership of the um, subcommittees for agriculture and for the agricultural committees are also anti-cannabis. We also, have to really sort of double down on this education about cannabis, this accepted medical use. We saw, first of all, we didn't see any comprehensive medical cannabis legislation introduced in the last session of Congress. But for, the bills that we're looking at, decriminalizing or, creating a pathway for adult use, or even hemp, all sort of made this mistake, I think a mistake, but we'll see, of trying to put cannabis into the FDA and regulating it like tobacco. And, not only would this, sort of probably get rid of most of the products that are available in both the hemp and adult use retail, you know, this is sort of puts medical cannabis back at the beginning, right? The Controlled Substance Act is not the only reason that we actually went to the states for safe access. So definitely the Controlled Substance Act meant a penalty that we would end up in jail for using cannabis. But, again, in this country, medicine is sort of synonymous with FDA approval. And, in order to, have access really to the healthcare infrastructure in this country, it requires FDA approval, which is, is not going to happen for cannabis until we create a pathway for that. So, yes, there was the sort of cannabis is being deemed Satan weed and a part of the Controlled Substance Act, but also there's just not currently a pathway for complex botanicals. And when the FDA points to these guidance documents for for those who want to create cannabis medicines, it's really disingenuous, because if you really look at these documents, they say themselves that they know that the botanical drug development process isn't a good fit for complex botanicals, which not all botanical medicines have as many active substances as cannabis, or as many active compounds. It's also disingenuous when you look at this program, the Botanical Drug Guidance, which was created in 2004. Only a couple, I think there's actually one more now, like only 3 drugs have actually come through that process, and they're for the most part single compound extractions. So very similar to the existing framework and view of sort of single drug, single target, magic bullet sort of concept of medicine. And our opponents often point to the fact that there are FDA approved drugs that are that doctors can write prescriptions for. And this is really where it takes some explaining to really understand why yes, that there you'll see some benefit from these concentrations of a single compound. That really where we're seeing most of the efficacy of cannabis is in these complex medical conditions, right? Which is where cannabis is really key of being able to that is utilize its multiple compounds to hit multiple targets in the body. And I think one of our, definitely one of our fears is that if, we don't have NIH, supporting research in a serious way. Um, we don't think that big pharma, I know there's a lot of anxiety that somehow big pharma is going to come in and take over the cannabis space, but it just isn't true. Cannabis has been available in pharmacies in Europe for over a decade, almost 2 decades, and pharma hasn't taken that process over. But there is a question, if we're depending on this sort of FDA approval, how will that happen, right? I think this is a very expensive process. It's about $2.6 billion to bring a drug through this approval process. And, GW Pharmaceuticals with Epidiolex, it wasn't a big money maker. And we know that, pharmaceutical companies, they're not necessarily interested in making a profit. They're interested in making an obscene profit. And, I think this is also a very compelling argument that there's sort of this view that that pharma is doing all this work on their own, which is why they can charge us whatever they want. That actually isn't true. That actually NIH plays a significant role in investing in preclinical work that actually later becomes drugs. So there's reports of this is a recent report that came out that it was actually looking at 356 of the last 358 drugs that were approved by the FDA, they depended on an investment of $1.4 billion per approval for, the sort of applied research. You'll see the U.S. didn't get paid back that money from the drug approval process, but it's almost like matching funds for pharma. And that just hasn't happened with cannabis. So NIH, during about that same period of time, or a little longer, actually has spent $1.4 billion on cannabis research, but a majority of that has been spent on investigating the harms. So without, sort of the preclinical work paid for, it's very unlikely that pharma is going to step up and take on this burden themselves, especially when cannabis is proven to be a generic. And this is dangerous if we're not studying the therapeutic benefits, especially at a time where there's sort of public health cries, trying to focusing on things like the cannabis use disorder, which, by the way, every patient would qualifies as having it. But I think that we're getting really close to running into a scenario where instead of ever getting to the point where NIH is making a serious attempt to study the benefits of cannabis, which they ignored the Institute of Medicine report in 1999. They've ignored the National Academy's report in 2017, and we haven't yet seen a research priority map or a decisive investment in cannabis research from the Research Act that was passed in 2022. We're very nervous that there could be a scenario where we see funds just staying in the sort of same players, looking at the harms of cannabis, but instead of under prohibition or complete prohibition, making the doubling down on, looking at the harms under a public health lens. And yes, we need to do that research and understand that, but I don't think we can fully understand why people are using cannabis unless we're studying, the medical side. And I think a perfect example of that is that, we now know, how patients are using cannabis, that they're not just adding cannabis to their treatments, they're actually substituting cannabis for other prescriptions. And so, people use sleep aids and muscle relaxants and painkillers on a daily basis, right? That's why we have cannabis use disorder. I've never heard of anti-inflammatory use disorder. And so here we are, right? We're at this space where, this is actually something we've been working on for 23 years. And, with the health agencies finally validating our experience, this is really where we were ready to move into Act Two. This is when we should be integrating cannabis into our healthcare systems instead of asking, whether or not there is, any validity in the medical use of cannabis. It's now time for us to say, okay, yes, there is. How do we get this to patients? And at Americans for Safe Access, we have been working on federal legislation that would create a national medical cannabis program that would include the creation of an Office of Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Control in HHS, not FDA, and the creation of a new schedule, a Schedule 6, that would include all cannabinoid products. And some of them would be over the counter, some of them would be eventually by prescription, but no different than the recommendation or ID cards. But eventually you won't have to pay for that ID card. But cannabis would be legal and actually would be integrated into our healthcare system. And this isn't some crazy idea that Americans for Safe Access has. Actually, as Congress has been contemplating what to do about cannabis, partly some of it has been sort of generated from the rescheduling process. Some of it has been a conversation looking at the FDA's and its lack of ability to regulate CBD. The Congressional Research Service has pointed out that Congress can create a new schedule for cannabis, and that Congress can create an alternative regulatory framework for cannabis. So with this sort of crack in this 50-year prohibition of cannabis, it's important to understand that this didn't just happen, right? That actually patient advocates, our members, were a major part of this, and this, our road to the sort of landscape that we're in now. Basically, patients went to the states because, when we went to our healthcare providers for help in, creating a pathways for safe access, they really felt like we were talking about apples and oranges, right? For, doctors really didn't necessarily want to participate in civil disobedience medicine. And so, we also, though, we're looking at a rescheduling petition that had failed in 2001 as sort of a guidance document. I think a lot of people, for good reason, always sort of look at things that DEA says about cannabis as propaganda. But we really saw, as we were forming Americans for Safe Access, we saw this rescheduling denial from 2001 as sort of a guidance document. It said, look, you need to have product safety protocols. You need to be able to identify the constituent components in cannabis. You've got to, change the scheduling of cannabis at the UN. So definitely when I founded ASA as a cocky 25-year-old, I was thinking we would finish this in a couple of years, but here we are 23 years later. But along the way, we created the state programs really as triage to get patients off the battlefield, create a place for them to safely access cannabis while we took on these bigger projects. And I think a lot of people that are kind of coming into the cannabis space right now may not realize this history, right? The goal of medical cannabis is not the state programs, right? The goal of medical cannabis advocacy is definitely not adult use, right? That I'm glad more people are staying out of jail, but that's not necessarily the goal of the work that we do. And when you see these lists of states, people rattle off these numbers all the time, but to say in Texas, there's a shit ton of work, right, to get these programs in place. So, passing the law was the easy part. You'll hear next week from our friends in Nebraska who are in it right now. The actual implementation part is, it is really where the work begins. And, back when we started ASA, we had to sue every state agency just to make them implement the law. We had to sue the California Highway Patrol and the DMV. We had to sue cities and counties. And then we had this backdrop of these DEA raids happening, and we had to, organize to stop those raids. And we had to create product safety protocols for cannabis, right? We had to start from scratch. These didn't exist before we partnered with the American Herbal Products Association and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia. And this is really how we, I mentioned Michael McGuffin before, but, when I first started ASA, there were, only 8 states that had medical cannabis laws, and they were just criminal exemptions, right? There was no access program. All the access was happening sort of underground, through patient collectives. And as we went to the states and tried to create distribution programs, we were getting a lot of pushback. Because departments of health didn't know how to regulate cannabis. And so it was really through us rolling up our sleeves and partnering with the American Herbal Products Association, that we were able to create these product safety protocols. And we issued them in the form of recommendations from regulators. And once we had these, then, state regulators felt comfortable actually overseeing the medical cannabis programs we have today. Passing the CJS amendment that I mentioned was not easy. We had to keep track of every single federal interference. Out of the 500 raids and arrests, we held over 300 protests the day of these raids. People showed up with signs while the raid was happening saying, DEA, hands off my medicine. We had to run attack ads against politicians. So this was quite a bit of work to actually get this law passed. We were able to I feel like I've been making lemonade for a long time, but we were able to take the last rescheduling denial and use the DEA's own words against them, and utilizing the Data Quality Act, and had them take down misinformation on their website that they had contradicted themselves, including this gateway theory nonsense. Again, we were able to change the scheduling of in the UN treaties. We were able to, pass the Research Act, but specifically create explicit legal protections for medical professionals. And then all of this work, we were able to present and work closely with the HHS and the FDA on their rescheduling proposal. And, it's worth mentioning that this is what allowed us and will allow the United States to move forward with the national program. But, things have changed, right? I think the opioid epidemic, more medical professionals are open to, to looking at more tools than sort of the traditional FDA-approved drugs. I think one of the lessons that we've all learned from the opioid epidemic, which is really out of the pain epidemic, is that doctors need more tools. And it's, not just pain. And we have all these chronic conditions that, don't have pharmaceutical solutions. And we're just seeing, over prescription, over prescriptions, over, approaches with polypharmacy. And, we can't afford it, but also people aren't getting better. And there's a worldwide call for, looking at botanical medicines, because they are, by their own nature, complex, and these diseases are complex, right? They're, cancer, immune disorders, they're not just one sort of system that has gone afoul, so this idea of the single drug, single target approach to drug development, which has served us well, is not going to address this crisis of chronic conditions. And so, here we are, yes, we have all of these states, but, what we have in the state programs, it's compassionate use. Patients are still sort of on their own, trying to figure out what works for them. And, there's no, not necessarily products that are being developed based on our experience or based on research. We know that these state programs aren't ultimately working for patients. There's, millions of people that are left out of the state by state approach. The 21, the adult use market is not working for patients despite, sort of what people are reporting. This is not a long-term solution for patients. And, for a patient, just because all these states have medical cannabis laws, it doesn't mean that, patients have access everywhere. I mean, it's pretty hard in many states for patients to qualify. There's a lot of barriers. In fact, when we, did a study back in 29 or 2018 to look at, how states were approaching the opioid epidemic. I think this was a case study of Michigan. We found that, out of the 9 million people living in Michigan, 5 million weren't even eligible to participate. So we have lots of resources on our website about our federal legislation. If you want more information, if you're with an organization that would like to know more or would like to endorse the legislation, I encourage you to go to this page. You can actually, from this page, sign up and you can schedule a presentation for your organization about the legislation. You can read the legislation here. There's tons of, tools, one-pagers, presentations. And, I just want to leave everyone this idea that, last year, what we learned from Congress, I spent a lot of time earlier talking about our opponents, but even our allies, have these misconceptions that, Schedule 3 is just going to take care of medical cannabis patients, or that, we're just fine getting medicine from the adult use and hemp markets. And, it's just, they need to hear from you. And, I think that there's this sort of I think there's a lot of reasons why people don't reach out to their elected officials. But, it's the only way to move forward. One of my mentors, Congressman Sam Farr, used to say, politics is not a spectator sport. You've got to get involved. And so we have lots of tools to make that easier for you. If you haven't reached out to your 2 senators and congressmen or congresswomen yet, they've just started a new Congress. And so it's always good to hear from their constituents. But, I just want to remind you that if you're not talking to them, it doesn't mean that they're not hearing about cannabis, right? There are people talking to your members of Congress, and they're only going to hear, the view of patients unless you are talking to them. It is not the job of elected officials to represent all of the laws of their state when they come to DC. Their job is to represent their constituents. And if you are not talking to them, how do they know how to represent you? But they are hearing from drug testing companies and law enforcement and other stakeholders, in your state. Right now, we are actually halfway through the 100 Days campaign. We've made all these actions super easy. So if you've got 1 minute, 5 minutes, or like want to dedicate the next 6 months, we can definitely put you to work. We want you to stay safe during this time. Use some of ACE's resources like our What's in Your Cannabis campaign, our Know Your Rights information. These are now both in English and Spanish. If you want more information about the rescheduling process, we're following it pretty closely on our blog. Actually, I think the very first Lunch and Learn series I did actually was really a deep dive into what happened and why the DEA hearings were postponed. So you can jump in there. sign up for alerts, stay informed. If you need resources to become a better advocate, actually look up, we're actually putting together a advocacy certification. They'll be coming out soon, but all of these resources are free. Download them, use them, and hopefully become a member of Americans for Safe Access, or you can make a donation so we can keep this work up. So join us next week. We're going to be talking to advocates, activists in Nebraska, get an update of the craziness that they are encountering as they're implementing their law. And, actually tomorrow is Patient Safety Awareness Week. So look out for some actions that you can do. I don't know if you celebrate Patient Safety Awareness Week, but there's definitely a lot that we can do to keep patients safe. So thank you so much. Have a great day, and I will see you next